Hello and welcome. My name is Nathalie Zechner. I'm a research assistant, senior scientist at the University of Klagenfurt at the Center for Sign Language and Deaf Communication. I am hard of hearing since the age of 2 and have problems understanding English pronunciation acoustically, but even more to pronounce it correctly and clearly. For this reason, my colleague Alexandra Pecher lends me her voice for my presentation. As part of my dissertation project, I am currently researching the education of hearing-impaired school children and what barriers they encounter due to their impairment. Hence, the topic: educational opportunities dependent on hearing status, experiences of hearing-impaired students. By way of introduction, I would like to discuss briefly the term hearing impairment. Hearing impaired means when people have a hearing loss. This loss can be mild, severe, or profound. Degrees of hearing loss refer to the severity of the loss and are generally described as mild, moderate, severe, or profound. Hearing loss that borders between two categories is typically labeled as a combination of the two categories. For example, thresholds at 60 decibel hearing loss might be called moderate to severe. Therefore, we distinguish between two groups of people: the hard of hearing and the deaf. Hearing-impaired people have reduced hearing ability, but they still can perceive spoken language through the ear, mostly with the help of hearing aids. This group of people is mostly speech-oriented and prefers the company of hearing people. Deaf persons can no longer perceive spoken language acoustically in a way to understand. They are visually oriented and communicate mainly in sign language. First of all, I would like to talk about the actual problem as well as the objectives of my work. In Austria, there are anti-discrimination and equality laws, including also the education system. These state that people with impairments must not be discriminated in any way, and that equal participation in all circumstances must be guaranteed for them. Austrian Sign Language was recognized in Austria in 2005, but has not yet been introduced as a language of instruction in Austrian schools. Hearing-impaired students still face barriers in education today. There are only a few schools for hard of hearing and deaf school children left, because many have closed down over time due to a lack of resources. Nowadays, the majority of hearing-impaired school children is placed in inclusion classes and taught together with hearing children. The language of instruction is spoken German. So, hearing-impaired students have a more difficult access to knowledge and information. Currently, as part of my dissertation project, research is being conducted in the educational setting of hearing-impaired school children. Using participant observations in the classroom, as well as interviews with the hearing-impaired school children, the following research questions will be addressed. What are the experiences and challenges of deaf and hard of hearing students? What can accessible classroom design look like from the perspective of hearing-impaired students? First results from the observations so far show that there are problems especially with knowledge transfer in the classroom. The main reason for this could be the lack of Austrian Sign Language, briefly ÖGS, as language of instruction. It could be observed that some teachers have worked on well-intentioned stopgap solutions in order to enable hearing-impaired school children and to make the classes and lessons as accessible as possible. Further, it could be observed that many deaf and hard of hearing children tend to withdraw when there are comprehension problems. Some of the interviewers stated that previous problems in class led to a lack of motivation to learn on their part. These results show that accessible teaching for hard of hearing and deaf pupils has not yet been implemented. Finally, the question remains, what approaches are necessary for the implementation of inclusion in the classroom for hearing-impaired people in Austria? The lack of trained sign language interpreters in Austria, as well as the few sign language competent teachers, are other problems that prevent barrier-free education for hearing-impaired school children. Among other things, this requires a sufficient budget, the anchoring of Austrian Sign Language as language of instruction, as well as the right to bimodal bilingual instruction, an instruction in which spoken language and sign language are spoken, signed, and promoted equally. This would mean that deaf and hard of hearing students would no longer be disadvantaged in the education system. It can be seen that there is still a great need for improvement in the education system for deaf and hard of hearing students. Despite all the efforts of teachers, it can be seen that for almost 20 years, the legally guaranteed accessibility for people with disabilities in education has been implemented for hearing impaired students only in a very rudimentary way. I will gladly accept questions and suggestions. Thank you very much.